Good evening, everybody. Thanks so much for coming out tonight. My name is Cassandra Szoeke, and on behalf of the Geelong Regional Library Corp, I'm delighted to welcome you all to tonight's event with author Dr Neela Janakiramanan discussing her latest novel, The Registrar. I'd like to start this evening by acknowledging the Wadawurrung and Eastern Maar traditional owners of the lands on which our library services operate. We pay respects to the Wadawurrung and Eastern Maar elders past, present and emerging, and elders of other communities who may be here today. The English word for land doesn't convey the traditional meaning, country, which really includes land, waters, plants, animals, stories, spirits and people. Therefore, we acknowledge and celebrate First Nations peoples of this land as the custodians of learning, literacy, knowledge and story. I'm really pleased today to have been invited to facilitate this evening's event. Dr Janakiramanan is a reconstructive plastic surgeon with wide experience working in the public and private health sector. She's a seasoned public speaker and advocate on issues including health equity, gender equity and diversity and inclusion. Neela's book, The Registrar, was shortlisted for the 2021 Victorian Premier's Award for an unpublished manuscript. The Registrar offers a rare insight into the world of a surgeon in the making from one who's actually survived it. It's told with compassion, skill and emotional heart. It's a gripping and moving novel and goes behind the headlines to reveal the human experience of both being a doctor and a patient in a medical system at breaking point. Please join me in welcoming Dr Neela Janakiramanan. So why don't we start with you telling me why you pretended this was a fiction book?
Thank you, Cassandra. It is definitely fiction, it is not a memoir, but I wrote it to be realistic because I wanted to actually shine a light on what happens in hospitals. And it is, in many ways, I suppose, a composite or a pastiche of many people's stories. Medical fiction is really hard to write because, of course, we draw from our own experiences, but I've got to protect my patients' confidentiality, the confidentiality of colleagues and others who have told me their stories. And so every scene that I chose was something that was common, that had happened to lots of people, either patients or clinicians, and that was relatively true to life. So it's definitely not a memoir, but a lot of doctors or patients, in fact, might think it's not fiction.
And look, on that, something that was a bit absent from the book, which you see in others, because there have been a few written now, was that element of anger. So talk to me about that.
The first draft was very angry. And look, there was a real process for me of growth and healing. The beauty of fiction is, with a memoir, it is a single person's perspective. And if you want that single person's perspective, you know, maybe it's Michelle Obama, and you want to know what's going on with Michelle, that's great. Whereas when you're talking more broadly about a system, one person has a single perspective, but in certain interactions, different people bring different things to it. So for me, writing the novel, it gave me a chance to go back and reflect on things that had happened to myself, interactions that I had had, and look at it from the point of view of different characters, so to write that scene realistically. So I certainly went through a process of, I suppose, healing, of, acknowledging things that had happened to me, to my colleagues, to my patients, by exploring it in that way.
So then I've got to ask you the question. Your protagonist, Dr Swan,
yes.
Why did you choose the person who has it easiest in the hospital, someone from a medical family?
Yeah. A lot of people have asked this, and some of my closest friends were like, why isn't she brown? And not in a bad way, but when I was thinking about her and her experience, what I've observed is when people have a difficult time in a workplace, whether that's the medical workplace or elsewhere, people point to features demographic features to say that's why they have an issue. They have a disability, so that's why this is happening to them. Or they are a person of colour and racism exists, so that's why it's happening to them. And I wanted to strip all of that away and make a character that was establishment medical family, was white, was wealthy, came from a privileged private school background, should know how the system works because she has multiple family members in it, and still faces adventures and misadventures, if you will. Because at that point, what you're looking at is the core of the issue, not all of the other stuff that actually makes the whole thing worse, if anything.
Yep. So where did you find the time as a plastic surgeon to write this book?
I think we all make time for things that are important to us. And for me, this was important because I got grumpy. I got grumpy because every time I turned on the television, there'd be some medical drama, whether it's Grey's Anatomy or The Good Doctor, and people love them. Every time something comes out, people watch them. But they're always American or British, and they are always told from a male perspective. There's always that godlike doctor at the top, like House, who knows everything. Women, where they are involved, are often having sex with men. And it's very, it just irritated me. Women are 50% of doctors now. They are most nurses, most allied health workers, most people who bring the tea trolley around, all of these essential workers in hospitals. And they are at least 50% of our patients as well. So I just got grumpy about, who's telling our stories? So that's why I made time for this.
So tell me a little bit, and all of us, about your other advocacy, because you're a closet advocate there.
A closet advocate. When Department of Home Affairs have you on their list, I don't think you're a closet advocate. So my advocacy, I give lots of talks about gender equity and health equity, but the main bulk of work I've done is in refugee advocacy. So I was involved in the Kids Off Nauru campaign. I was one of the medical leads for the Medivac legislation, which was around ensuring that refugees and asylum seekers in offshore detention, so Manus Island and Nauru, could get access to medical care.
So you wrote this book as a form of advocacy. What are you hoping happens?
I think when I started it, I had in my head that it was a form of advocacy. I think as it has gone on, what I've realised is all I can do is put this out there. Storytelling is a form of knowledge sharing, I think. And I think when we look at issues, we so often focus on statistics, numbers, we focus on facts, but we don't often focus on the impacts that certain things have upon people. We talk about burnout, but we never say, what is burnout? How does it manifest? What does it do to people in their day-to-day lives? And we know that understanding impact makes people change their behaviour. Every man who stands up, for example, and says, I've got a daughter and, I'd hate for this to happen to her. I don't think we can wait until everyone has a daughter or a sister or someone that they can point to as to why they should change their behaviour or the behaviour of the people around them. I think that storytelling is just a way to say, well, here is a character, get to like her, and then here is the impact of the system on her. And hopefully that will make people think about it, and hopefully that will make people think about how they want to change the system. It's not for me to say, here are all the solutions. It's just to say, well, here's a story. This is what happens to a lot of us. What are we going to do?
So let's talk about burnout, because particularly with the epidemic, the ongoing
yes.
epidemic, there's been a lot of stress on the healthcare system.
Yeah.
So what do you think about burnout, and what we should be doing?
Burnout is really complicated. I think it's a term that's really only come out in the last few years. And I think a lot of people, and myself included, think about it as, a kind of exhaustion from hours worked or the amount of work that is required to be done. But what we're understanding is that it is more complicated than that. And so there are certain things, there are words that I've learnt recently which are really useful. So assimilation trauma. I think is a really good concept. And it's the idea that if you have a workplace or a society, people who don't naturally fit into that have to learn how to assimilate into that. And so, you know, when I was young and I was told that's a male-dominated workplace, I just thought, there's a lot of men there. And that's fine, because I like men, you know, they're my friends, this is great. But what I didn't understand is what people mean by male-dominated workplace is a certain kind of man, a certain kind of alpha man, a certain kind of culture that comes with it. And so it's not about being friends with men, which I am. It's about that culture and fitting in, and not being able to is a form of trauma because you can't quite assimilate. Similarly, we talk about moral injury, which is where what you are being asked to do doesn't fit with your own personal moral framework. And that's something that we see a lot in soldiers and is known to contribute to post-traumatic stress disorder, is, being asked to kill someone is actually an insult to our own moral framework. And it's something they know about and sign up for, but the actual act of doing it causes an injury. And similarly in healthcare, if we see ourselves as a certain kind of clinician or providing a certain kind of care and we can't do it, that causes a moral injury. And so that's where no amount of reduced work hours, wellness training programs will actually help. You've got to actually address those core issues.
So that actually leads me to another question that at least once a week I get asked why I stick where I am instead of moving away. What do you do when you don't want to move away from a broken system?
I think that's really hard. I think it's a bit like in the family violence area where people say, well, why don't you just leave? And I think leaving can absolutely be the right decision for some people, but there are lots of circumstances where people don't want to leave. And similarly, using that family violence analogy, the recent report released by Anne Summers showed that women who leave family violence are often worse off because they can be destitute, they can be in poverty, we don't have the system to support them. And so I think that is analogous to workplaces where you might want to continue in that career, you might want to get to the end and become a specialist or whatever you're doing. And so to say, well, if it's causing you this much grief, just leave, is actually a bit of a problem. And if we all leave, then there's no doctors to take care of patients. So I think that we need to have conversations, not just about changing the system, but systems change is slow, but also how we support each other to protect our own mental health, protect our own families, and actually be able to achieve the career that we want without just saying, oh, you should just leave.
So let's talk about that. Let's talk about networks and how we can build those up to support us.
I think I went to this dinner, which was actually set up by another female plastic surgeon to connect plastic surgeons together. And I sat next to Gillian Triggs, who's an eminent human rights lawyer. And she was talking about her experience. She's a bit older now. She'd be in her 60s. And she was talking about her early years at a law firm where they knew that there was only a certain proportion of women who would be allowed to rise. And if those women rose to more senior positions and someone more junior came along and was then promoted, then they would be bumped off the top. And so there was no imperative for women to support each other because they were basically competing against each other, and there was also no prerogative for them to mentor anyone because they might then lose their career if they did so. So in this environment of scarcity, this is where the idea of women not being collaborative and, that queen bee myth came from. I personally think that has changed. I think that we are now in an ecosystem where more women can rise, and it's certainly not, we were talking about academia earlier, so it's not everywhere. There is still very competitive areas. But I think that the more we help each other and the more we support each other, the easier it is for us all to rise together.
And certainly I just feel I need to put a 2 cents in there. In some areas, it is really rare. As a professor in medicine, it's a rare position, but then you move internationally. So you can find support and networks internationally if you're finding in your locale it's not as supportive. So I have to ask you, page 186.
Very specific.
Your protagonists asks one of the characters, random, how would you reimagine the healthcare system? So Neela, how would you reimagine the healthcare system?
Look, to be honest, I think we need to throw the whole thing up in the air and like rearrange it as it falls. Because
Didn't COVID do that?
Oh, I don't know. Because we're tinkering around the edges. We have a system that puts a lot of money and a lot of intervention on acute care, not enough on preventative care, not enough on community medicine. The remuneration schemes are all over the place. The staffing issues are all over the place. There's no ability to flex up or down based on, whether it's flu season or COVID season or anything else. But what I do think is, and I think we've seen this in COVID, we have an incredibly well-trained medical workforce. And by medical, I mean doctors, nurses, allied health, everyone in this country. And what people did to provide healthcare in the pandemic was not anything that came from departments of health or from, ministries or anything like that. It was the local GPs who banded together and set up a respiratory clinic and then turned it into a vaccination hub. It was specialists at public hospitals who largely worked after hours and for free to set up infection control pathways and work out, how you get a COVID patient from the emergency department to an operating theatre and then to ICU without infecting other people. And so small teams work together to ultimately provide really world-class care and deliver really good outcomes for this country. And I think every time I come back to it, what I come back to is if we talk to the workers, if we respect the workers, that they know their local population, they know what needs to be done, and empower them to make those changes without all of this bureaucratic noise, that would be a pretty good start.
Ground force movement.
Yep.
Systems change, take away the system.
Yes. Yeah.
Shh, this has been recorded. Okay. So your protagonist is an orthopod trainee. You're a plastic surgeon. Why did you choose orthopaedics?
I wanted to make it very clear that it was not a memoir. So I did not want a plastic surgeon as a protagonist. I personally do surgery that is sort of 50% in the orthopaedic sphere, and I had done a lot of orthopaedic surgery when I was younger, so it was something that was familiar to me. Whereas, for example, I'd never done cardiothoracic surgery as a term, so that wouldn't have worked. To be honest, the specialty and the medicine was less important to me than the overall story of a registrar. But what I chose, I wanted it to be true to life, so therefore I wrote what I knew. I couldn't have had a physician, for example. I've never been a med-reg.
I'm not offended, it's okay. It's okay. So I wanted to ask you a difficult question now. Often, some things come to light or are books because people think, that's a horror story, so that's why they're hearing it. I want to talk about sexual harassment and ask you, was it in there because it's a 1 in a million but you had to put it in there, or is it common?
Oh, it's incredibly common. It's common in the population and it is common in the medical workforce.
Are you going to tell us your story?
Look, I recently sat down and I worked out that between being an intern to when I finished my training, I'd done 21 terms. And a term is just a group of people that you work with for a period of time, and that can be anywhere from 10 weeks through to 12 months. And I was sexually harassed or assaulted in 18 of those 21 terms. And when I was a junior doctor, I watched what happened to women who reported this. They weren't protected and their career suffered as a consequence. There is a somewhat handsome but lecherous character in my novel. And when I wrote that, I wanted it to, again, there were probably, storytelling decisions that had to be made about how that played out. And the reason I pitched it in the way that I did was because I wanted to show the power imbalance, the insidious nature of the way in which men behave. And if we use, I guess, examples from Parliament House, there are multiple episodes of men behaving in these ways, ranging all the way from, outright egregious rape, all the way through to those insidious relationships where women look back and they think, I don't know how I got there. And I do think that women's experiences will fall somewhere in that spectrum. And so for me, there were storytelling decisions to be made about how I describe what happens with those characters.
There's a huge issue there, and one that's talked about a lot, but not enough's being done. What would you do?
I would encourage anyone in any workplace to not assume that their workplace is safe, because people, when there are so many costs to reporting it, we can't assume that just because no one is reporting something that everything is okay. And if I go back, and this is from a place of writing a novel and healing through the process. I'm not angry at any of the people who did this. I don't want to name them anymore. But I do worry a little bit about if that was the behaviour they exhibited to me, what are they doing to other people? But I also recognise that I can't personally protect everyone. So it's as a woman, it's trying to find that balance. So what I would encourage everyone to do is look around the room, because some of those people that I worked with who did that, their immediate colleagues would be very surprised if I named them. And so I would encourage people to look around at the people that they work with and go, well, is everyone okay? Is everyone behaving appropriately? Does everyone know what the appropriate way to behave is? And even if they do know, are they actually doing it? And actually ask particularly junior vulnerable women on the unit or their workplace if they're safe. And that gives them an opportunity to say no without actually pointing fingers at anyone. And if the answer is no, then it then becomes the organisation's responsibility to sort that out, work it out, and sometimes simply making everyone aware that that eye is turning towards that group of individuals and they need to be careful about their behaviour may be warning enough for some people to change that behaviour.
So on a more positive note,
yes.
Looking at relationships in medicine, and this is a notorious story trope, how do you think you can balance relationships? Children, she has 3 children and a wonderful husband. So give us your secret.
I have a wonderful husband. But, more seriously, I do think that partners, friends, parents, siblings bear a huge burden of the kinds of hours that we work and the ways that we are forced to live. And I know that I'm as guilty as the next person of giving my best self to my colleagues and my patients, and my next best self to my friends and acquaintances, and my absolute worst self to my husband and children. So, marry someone who puts up with that from time to time, but also be honest about it and recognise when you're doing it. And it can be really hard to change behaviour because you're doing it generally not because you're an awful person, but because there are pressures and stresses that you're taking out on the people who you know or you think will bear it. And so sometimes, for me, I apologise, and I might not stop being grumpy and cranky, but at least people recognise that I know that it's happening, and that in and of itself can make it a bit easier to manage.
And do you think we can change it so that that's just not a thing?
I really hope so.
Okay, I have to open the floor so that you guys get to ask your questions. So I'm just going to ask one more.
Yeah.
Sequel.
Probably not another medical drama.
So we never know if she has 3 children.
No. That's a really interesting question, and as a reader, I have often gotten to the ends of a book and gone, but what happens? And, authors say, I don't know. And I'm like, but how can you not know? How have you not plotted out their entire life? And now I'm the author. I'm like, I don't know what happens to her. I haven't thought that far. So, no, probably not a sequel to this one, but there's a few other bits and pieces in the works.
So joining my last two questions together, why couldn't you write the sequel fixing the system, hypothetically, and see if people will follow that?
Because that would be speculative fiction.
Good speculative fiction. I'd read that. All right, shall we open the floor for questions? What we'll do is we'll ask you guys to wait for the microphone, just because we've got people off-site viewing who won't hear you otherwise, even if you yell.
Hi, I've noticed there are a few males here. Do you think the male audience will actually read this book because they're the ones that still have the power?
I hope they will. I had my book launch last night, and some of my senior colleagues did come along and they did buy the book. And it's been out for a week, so some of them had read it before they arrived. And one of my very dear mentors, who is a wonderful man who tries very hard and acknowledges that he gets things wrong sometimes, came up to me at the end, quite emotional, and said, you know, I just think we could do more, and I'm going to start by changing my business card. I'm going to change it from Mr. to Doctor, and I should have done it years ago, but I can see how us using Mr. as this elevated title when it's not available to female surgeons isn't fair. So this is the thing I'm going to do. And the context is there has been a campaign from the College of Surgeons to move towards equal titling regardless of gender. And I know it sounds like a small thing, but it was someone who was clearly wanting to be better and do better and highlighting one little actionable thing that they could do tomorrow to make change. And that really touched me. And I think that socially, men are reading the book, men are sharing the book. It's being given to them by the women in their lives, or, you know, they're seeking it out themselves. So I do hope that people will.
One of the lovely things about it being a compilation is every male surgeon should get out there and read it, make sure they're not featured in it.
That's it.
Thank you very much. That's been a very interesting conversation, and I saw part of your interview this morning. I'd just like to say, as a nurse and midwife in years gone by, that there is a book called Women, Witches and Midwives, and it talks about how men changed the face of childbirth to make them the heroes instead of women. Yes. And I think when I was listening to I have not read your book yet. Okay. When I was listening to some of the things, I think that it is, and what you've been saying, it is that thing of understanding and looking at where we are at and where we've come from. And I think what you're talking about is a great revolution, and it's got a long way to go.
Yeah, there is. And I think it's important to acknowledge that the Western practice of medicine is steeped in patriarchy and men taking over the healing role from women who were nurses, who were midwives, who were healers for a long time, and setting up systems in such a way that they are patriarchal and they are dominated by men. I mean, if we go back to Joseph Lister and hand washing, that came about because women were dying of sepsis because men would go from the dissecting room where they were working with cadavers to delivering babies, and women would get infections, and when they were told to wash their hands, they said, oh, but gentlemen don't have dirty hands, and they would refuse to wash their hands. So this is, even if you are not a man, when you are forced to assimilate into a system like that, then these are the behaviours and the ways of thinking that we perpetuate. So, you know, maybe we do need to go back to witchcraft.
More questions? I might pick up on that last question about revolution. You know, your training was some time ago. Why did you write the book now? Do you feel there's a ground force shift in the universe?
I wish so. I wrote it now. Well, the impetus for me writing it was actually quite a sad moment in my life. I had been a specialist for about 5 years, and a few years previous to that, when I was a first-year specialist, I had worked at a large Melbourne public hospital with
The Mount?
No. It was actually a better hospital than the Mount, to be fair. But with a first-year anaesthetic specialist, and we were just allocated the same operating lists at the same time, and we spent hours and hours and hours together sharing stories about what it had been like to be a registrar. And we worked together for about 6 months, and then I left. I went overseas to do some extra training, and I came back to Melbourne a few years later, and I went to work at different hospitals. And one evening, years have gone by, I was chatting with a friend who just in passing said, when so-and-so died. And that's how I found out that colleague I had worked with had died of suicide about 6 months after I worked with her. And that was the impetus for the book. I sat down and I wrote the first 3 chapters that night. My publisher then cut 2 of those chapters, as publishers are wont to do. But, and I think, we have so many stories to share and tell, and the impacts are so significant. That's why I wrote the book years later. But likewise, I do think that when authors write, we obviously put a lot of ourselves into it. We also carry a lot of risk, particularly when we're telling our own stories. And that isn't something that the publishing industry or readers necessarily know or respect. And to be honest, from a publishing point of view, the more raw the emotion, probably the better it sells. And so there is a real impetus for this, as one of my friends calls it, the first-person industrial complex of, using people's souls and their stories to print money. And so for me, the whole writing and editing process took a few years, but it was, I would caution people to not tell their stories when they're so raw, because they may end up in a situation where they have regrets about the way that it happened.
I think that's important advice, because there's obviously a lot of stories out there to be told, which I will get to the questions in a second. So in the Parliament, they're now talking about a reporting system.
Yes.
So that's great for Parliament House. Why are we not doing a reporting system in every single workplace?
I think reporting systems are really challenging because the mere act of reporting puts the person who is reporting at risk. Risk professionally, but also risk emotionally. And so you can't have a reporting system unless you've got protections in place to offer counselling and support at the time of disclosure. And that takes resources and money. And so it's certainly not something that human resources departments in public hospitals are equipped to manage.
But we learn from Parliament House, when you report within the House, the House maybe doesn't deal with that. So surely an independent agency for reporting would solve all the industry's problem.
Yeah, and there may be a scenario where a single person doesn't want to take down a single perpetrator because it's impossible for that to be fully confidential, obviously. But, a reporting system whereby the report is made anonymously and the information is stored, but the name of the perpetrator, if 2 or 3 or 4 people say the same thing, that name triggers, and then all of a sudden you've got a few people who can potentially band together to say, hang on, there's a problem, or an organisation can go to that person and say, look, we have some concerns that have been raised by a lot of people over a period of time, XYZ needs to change. And even having that as a system might potentially dissuade some behaviour, because what we know is it's not a lack of education. People know that their behaviour is inappropriate. They do it because they can get away with it.
Questions from the audience?
Hi, Neela. So you have a demanding job and a family. When and how do you write? And do you have a writing routine? And do you ever sleep?
Yes, I definitely sleep. I have a degree of post-traumatic stress disorder from not sleeping for 5 years, and so I'm militant about my sleep. I have no writing routine whatsoever, but in part that's because I do it as a hobby, and I've learnt to be forgiving with myself for not writing to a timetable. I do a lot of driving, so I spend a lot of time thinking, and once an idea or a scene or something is relatively crystallised, I'll sit down and I'll write it all out. And similarly with the whole editing process, largely it was done in short bursts of time, so time that I took off work to go away for a long weekend or something like that, away from the family, and just try and smash it out and get it done. Children and career and other obligations force efficiency.
Surgical training program forces efficiency. Public health system forces efficiency.
Yeah.
And we've become so efficient now, they cannot cut it down any further.
Yeah.
Questions? So there's this light shining in my eyes, so I can't see. All right. In that case, I might ask you to tell us, what's your favourite part of the book?
Oh, that's a very good question. There is a scene where the main character, there are lots of characters in the book. There is one through story of a patient who we meet on the first page, and she goes all the way through to the end. And in the middle, she's having a fairly significant operation, and there's a lot of drama that happens during that, and a few mistakes perhaps are made. So there is a moment of levity. So I quite like that bit. But also, I mean, this will sound really naff. I still find the ending quite emotional. I still, I've read it, I don't know how many hundreds of times, but I still get to that, and it reminds me of people that I know and have known, and
Now, I know you said you're not doing a sequel, but how many doctors have written to you with their stories saying, here's some material for your next one?
Interestingly, lots of people have sent me very kind messages, but mostly what they have said is thank you for telling our story. I think that there is probably, most people would have experienced at least a couple of the things that happen across the book.
I certainly asked her which hospital it was, and I thought I had the answer, but it's a compilation of hospitals. So. Yeah.
Hi Neela, thanks so much for coming today. I sometimes wonder if my child asked me this, what I would do, and I wonder what you would do if one of my children said, I want to be a doctor like you, Mum.
Yep.
What would you do?
That's a really hard question. I think medicine is a wonderful field. We've talked a lot of issues today, but I love my job. I love my job. I love turning up. I love my patients, and and if we get down to the nitty-gritty of it, it's a high prestige, well-remunerated job as well. And we can't escape that as a fact. What I think I would have wanted, give me one sec, is to be more forewarned of what the issues are and how to not necessarily manage them myself, but how to navigate complex issues. I don't think I would tell my children not to do it, but I think I would try and help them go in with their eyes wide open and with contingency plans and a deep understanding of what some of the issues might be. When I look back to some of my struggles, it was in part because I didn't know what to do, and I put up with stuff for longer than perhaps I should have, or I dealt with it in maladaptive kinds of ways. And I think one of the things that we're getting better at is, it's not just sessions like this, but even within medical school. I spoke at a recent medical school conference for the Melbourne students, and they had sessions on burnout. They had sessions on long work hours and what the union can do to assist with that. They had sessions on mental health. They had sessions on work-life balance, like all of this stuff that I just never got taught. I got taught anatomy and physiology, and off you go and listen to that heart murmur. So I think that we're getting better at making people aware of it.
Yeah, thank you very much for coming. I am curious to know whether the final editing was about, in some way, reducing the impact of the story, as in making it more commercial, more saleable, less offensive to some.
No, not at all. Neither my agent nor publisher asked me to water it down at all. When I say I took out the anger, what I mean is I took out the identifiable surgeons. Yeah, I had often, dropped little things that only certain people would know, so that they would know it was them. So that got taken out, but in terms of the story and the narrative arc and the impact, that wasn't. And the structural edits that I got back were really about, and I think this is what a lot of authors get, is, the consistency of behaviour and the characters. They do this here and that there, and that doesn't seem quite consistent. And about gaps in the story, or develop this particular character a bit better. So, for example, in my head, I knew what the father was, but I guess because in my head I knew exactly what he was, I hadn't described it particularly well, so we added a few scenes where we could see what he was.
Thank you. Do you think the postgrad doctors coming through now are a little more resilient, or maybe a little better able to cope because of previous life experience? Does it make a difference?
I think it's tricky. The thing with the postgraduate doctors is that I think we ask more of them, because they do sometimes come along with more responsibilities outside of medicine. So they're a bit older, they have partners, they have children. So the traditional way of you're an intern and you can just work all of these hours doesn't really work. So perhaps the cost to them ultimately is greater. I do think that age brings maturity, which is something I would have revolted against and never admitted when I was 20. But now that I have quite a lot of grey hair, I'm quite happy to admit. And I think that life experience is really important. Selection is interesting in medicine. We have a very academic selection process in Australia. When I was in the Netherlands, they select for medical school by lottery. Which is really interesting. So you go through high school and you're either in a trade pathway or an academic pathway, which is not mandated. The school will give you a little bit of encouragement one way or another, but it's a decision for the family. And if you've gone through that academic pathway and you hit a minimum academic standard, which is actually not that high, you can do any course, whatever, that you want at university. But medicine, they had an issue when they had that rule, because too many people selected medicine, and then they had backlogs in the training pathway, and then they had too many doctors, and then you had underemployed doctors, and doctors aren't very good for much else. And so they then had to put a limit on medical student numbers, and so they did that. They still wanted to be egalitarian, and so they introduced a lottery. And so it means that their students, and therefore their doctors, are actually quite a lot more diverse. They come from more diverse socioeconomic backgrounds. They come from more diverse ethnic backgrounds. And briefly they went back to a merit-based selection system and then abandoned it because what they found is that that actually selected worse doctors than the lottery did. And I think that that's something that we have to recognise in medicine, is that just because medicine has always looked like a certain thing for a long time, that doesn't mean that we have been doing it well. And so how can we start it right from selection all the way through to training? How can we do it better, and how can we produce people who are good for the role of providing healthcare to a diverse community, and not necessarily does this person look like that professor over there? With no apologies to this professor, because she's wonderful.
I look nothing like a traditional professor, so none taken. I think this is a really great question, though, especially if we talk about gender equity and look at female reproductive situation, which we haven't managed to extend past 50 yet. So with the reproductive years for women being from 20 to 30, before that exponential curve takes off where doctors scare you to death. I was a geriatric pregnancy. You know, ultimately you have to have your children before 40 without risking health complications. And if we are now almost 100% postgraduate medicine, and if you look at the mean age, a lot of people will get in not just after a 3-year degree, but after honours and PhD or masters. You know, there is a different pressure on women in this system. And again, you go to merit. So you're then selecting people who can get H1 across 9 years. They have to have an ATAR of this to get into biomed. They have to have GAMSAT of that to get into, and so on and so forth. It is a very interesting selection, and we have to think about what we're getting at the end of that. And certainly just being female doctor, a lot of young people come to me and say, when should I have my children? And I don't know how to advise them, because I didn't go through that process. So I had them, whereas they're older than I was when I had them, when they're getting into medicine and internship. Yeah, sorry, you had a question.
That was a very good segue. I work in the gender equality space at the Public Health Service here, so we're implementing the Gender Equality Act. And so just wondering, do you have any advice on some things to focus on about gender equality in the medical field? Obviously working within the constraints of the system that we're in as an individual organisation.
I think one of the challenges is translating rights into practice, because you can have anti-discrimination legislation, but it is still legal to select someone on the basis of whether or not they are a good fit to the organisation. And so if your organisational culture is very narrow, then the people that you select based on good fit are likely to demographically be very similar to the other people in the organisation. So you're not intending to discriminate on the basis of race or ability or gender or anything like that, but you end up doing so. And I think, I mean, we talk a lot about unconscious biases which come into hiring and promotion, but I actually think that that culture and good fit problem is even more insidious, because even when you're aware of your unconscious biases and you work to try and get past them, you still have this sense of, well, is this person going to, you know, do whatever the organisation does, go to the pub for a beer afterwards, or, you know, join the football tipping competition, or whatever it is. So I think all I would say is, fantastic you're doing it, really, really hard, but unless you look at it at the other end and say, right, who have we hired over the last 5 years? Who have we promoted over the last 5 years? And is that diverse? And if not, why not? If you're not doing that post hoc analysis, then you could think you're doing all of the right things and still be failing.
I'll add to that. Sometimes we look at gender issues or race issues as a pipeline issue. Let's fix the pipeline. And what's hilarious about that is the issue is, at the end of the pipeline, you've got very few. So you just keep feeding them into the pipeline. You still end up 10 years, 13 years later, as it happens, with the same number of people, because there's a problem with the pipeline. Whereas often it's like, oh, we're going to fix it by getting lots of new early career researchers or registrars or in training people. but you haven't actually even looked at that pipeline issue. And so you're actually committing all those people to fall off the edge of a cliff, which I think is negligent. And then the second thing is what I said. The exam, I know the book's only just out, so not everyone's read it, but when you read the book, there's the exam.
In capitals.
Which in my day, in my field, had a 30% pass rate first time. So no one's going to have kids before it. I only had kids when I got through it. And if you're delaying that to 36, I think that's a real issue.
Yeah.
So, you can't change the whole system, but I really think you have to let females into medical school earlier.
Yeah. I did have kids before the exam.
You're a surgeon.
I had
Try
2
the
kids
physician's
before the exam, and I failed the exam. And no, it's fine. I've since passed, and it is an exam with a 50% fail rate. But I still don't know if I failed because I had kids and I didn't know enough. I'm pretty sure that's not the reason. I'm pretty sure the reason I failed is because from the moment I announced my first pregnancy, I was told I would fail the exam. Because there was no way you could do it. And then I had a second kid and I was definitely going to fail the exam because how could you do it with 2 children? Because the exam is not just about your knowledge and skills, it's about your confidence, it's about your performance, because there's a Viva component to it as well, so it's not just written. And so you have to stand up and be interrogated by your peers. And if all you've got in the back of your head is, you're going to fail the exam, you're going to fail the exam, you're going to fail the exam, the first stumble, you go, oh, I've already failed the exam, I'll just give up now.
I hear you, but I had it much easier than you.
Yeah.
I'm glad you did it, and thousands of women do it every day, but why are we making it so hard for women?
Exactly. No, absolutely. Yeah.
Sorry, we're just having a nice little conversation here. Any other questions from the audience? Sorry.
Congratulations.
We've never seen women before. We've got, I have a lot of mentors within my class group who are here tonight, who I think are amazing women with young children who have led the way for me to feel like I can succeed and achieve in the career that I've chosen, and that life will work for me.
Yeah.
So I think the balance is coming.
Yeah. Thank you.
So you would advise your children to do medicine?
Yes.
My 2 are there? Yes. We have 4 minutes to go, so we have time for one more question. Any questions out there? Then I will leave the last 4 minutes to you to take us out.
I'm glad we finished with that story of hope, because I do think that...
I was going to have 2 hours to talk to them afterwards, and you just fixed that for me, so thank you.
I think the culture broadly is changing. Terrible things happen in Parliament House, and then tens of thousands of women march to say that's not good enough. Terrible things happen in healthcare, but we find ways to band together. And, one of my favourite little groups is, I have a chat group called the Female Hand Surgeons of Australia and New Zealand. And there's about 13 of us, and we are everywhere. We're from Christchurch to Cairns to Melbourne. And we, in a specialty where women were often not included and where career progression, not just career progression, but maintaining your skills and having the guts to undertake more and more complicated procedures, which is important in surgery, was often limited because we were pushed out of centres of excellence or to regional areas. women have struggled to thrive, you know, this is a group where we can, and we continue to do these challenging cases because we can text each other and say, here are some x-rays, what would you do? And we give each other support without that condescension or without that sort of sense of, oh, why don't you know already? And I think that there are so many groups and networks of doctors, whether they're female doctors, whether they're doctors of colour, whether they are doctors with disabilities, doctors with, you know, who are single parents. And there is that opportunity to network, to support each other, to lift each other, and to have conversations like this, which I would have given an arm and a leg for, you know, 10, 15 years ago. So I do think that the world is slowly changing.
I think the only reason we halted was believing we had equity.
Yeah.
And I think just saying that's not actually true has changed a lot.
Yep.
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
And thanks
Cassandra.
for being a great audience. No hecklers tonight. Excellent.
And great questions.
I wanted to let everyone know that tonight's event is also being recorded, so if you check Geelong Regional Library's website, that'll be available on the library's YouTube channel in the next few days. And also we've got the Book Grove here, and they're selling copies of Neela's book, for those of you who don't have one already, so you can have a copy, and also Neela will sit at the table and give you a personal signature for each one of those before you leave tonight, but she won't tell you where the mount is because I already asked her. Thank you so much.
It's not a real place.
Yes, it is. I have been there. So thank you everyone so much for coming today, and on behalf of Geelong Regional Libraries, we really hope to see you here again soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was lovely.